To understand individuation as the true form of self-improvement, one must first dismantle the modern myth that becoming your best self involves accumulation of habits, of achievements, of social approval, of curated identities. This outer pursuit is seductive because it mimics progress. It offers measurable metrics and visible transformation. But for Carl Jung, this is a surface illusion, a distraction from the actual journey that takes place inward, in the invisible realm of the psyche. Individuation, as he defined it, is the process of becoming a whole individual, not an ideal individual, not a perfect being, but a unified one. Someone who has faced, accepted and integrated all the scattered and hidden elements of their inner world. The modern individual often seeks optimization, not transformation. There is a difference. Optimization is a technological impulse. One seeks to become more efficient, more productive, more appealing. This is a mechanistic view of the self, as though one were a machine that simply needed an upgrade. Transformation, by contrast, is alchemical. It demands inner confrontation, decay, contradiction, and renewal. Jung's notion of individuation places the psyche at the center of this transformation. It is not about turning oneself into an ideal, but about recovering parts of the self that have been forgotten, suppressed, denied, or feared. Within each person lies not a single identity, but a constellation of personas, impulses, and archetypes. Some known, some buried. The ego, which is our conscious self-image, often maintains control by pushing what it does not like or understand into the unconscious. But what is buried does not die. It influences from the shadows. So long as these elements remain unconscious, they distort our relationships, decisions, and sense of meaning. We may act with confidence but feel hollow. We may achieve much yet carry an unshakable sense of fraudulence or dissatisfaction. Jung believed that the psyche yearns for wholeness, and that wholeness can only be achieved through a gradual and painful reconciliation with these unconscious parts. In modern life, people often confuse perfection with completion. Perfection is a one-sided ideal, a mask worn by the ego to shield itself from its own vulnerabilities. It is the polished persona that wins approval but remains fragile and hollow within. Completion, on the other hand, implies the integration of both light and shadow, success and failure, clarity and confusion. In the process of individuation, one must accept their contradictions, the angry part, the jealous part, the insecure part. These are not to be exiled, but listened to, explored, and ultimately integrated. This is not a process of self-improvement in the conventional sense, but of deepening into the totality of being. Dreams are one of the primary ways the unconscious communicates its contents. They are not random or meaningless. They are symbolic expressions of the psyche's condition. To engage with dreams is to begin a dialogue with the deeper self. Symbols emerge from dreams that speak to what is missing, what is repressed, or what is trying to be born within the personality. This symbolic language is often dismissed by the rational mind, but Jung saw it as essential to individuation. The rational mind wants clarity. The soul wants depth. The former looks for facts. The latter longs for meaning. In this way, individuation is not about solving the self like a puzzle, but about unfolding it like a mystery. The ego resists this journey because it fears dissolution. It fears what it cannot control or predict. It fears the unconscious because within it lies chaos, desire, fear, and power. But Jung did not see the unconscious as merely dark or pathological. He believed it contained the seeds of creativity, insight, and spiritual renewal. The challenge is to relate to it rather than be ruled by it. To do this requires honesty, solitude, and patience. It requires facing aspects of oneself that are uncomfortable or painful. But every step toward that inner truth is a step towards psychic wholeness. One of the key tasks in individuation is the confrontation with the shadow, the dark twin of the ego. The shadow holds everything we have disowned: rage, shame, envy, lust, laziness, weakness. But it also holds vitality, power, and authenticity. To face the shadow is to reclaim what has been lost. Most people avoid this confrontation, projecting their shadow onto others, demonizing what they refuse to see in themselves. But individuation demands that we withdraw these projections and own what is ours. In doing so, we begin to dissolve the split between who we think we are and who we truly are. This internal reconciliation extends beyond the shadow. It includes the encounter with archetypes, like the anima and animus, the inner feminine in men, the inner masculine in women. These archetypes guide us toward balance and inner union. They emerge in dreams, relationships, and intense emotional experiences. To work with these energies is to expand our identity beyond the narrow limits of gender, culture, and upbringing. It is to discover new dimensions of the self that have long been waiting to be known. Individuation is a path of descent before it becomes a path of ascent. One must go down into the underworld of the psyche, where the familiar dissolves and the soul is stripped bare. There is often a crisis or breakdown that signals the beginning of this process. Something no longer works. A marriage collapses. A career loses meaning. A depression sets in. These moments are not failures of self-improvement. They are invitations to individuation. The old ego dies so that a more complete self can emerge. This rebirth is not instantaneous. It is gradual, often painful, and deeply personal. In today's culture, speed and efficiency are prized. But individuation cannot be rushed. It unfolds in cycles, sometimes over an entire lifetime. It requires listening to dreams, to synchronicities, to intuition. It requires creating space for silence and solitude, for journaling and inner work. The goal is not to eliminate suffering, but to find meaning within it. Jung believed that suffering is often the result of a misalignment between the ego and the deeper self. When we deny our inner truth to please others or conform to roles, we create inner tension. The remedy is not compliance, but confrontation. Not avoidance, but depth. There is no formula for individuation because each person's psyche is unique. The journey is not to become someone else, but to become oneself, fully, consciously, and responsibly. This involves making peace with one's limitations and accepting the imperfection that comes with being human. It also involves discovering one's vocation, not just in the professional sense, but in the psychological sense. What is the soul asking to express? What inner image seeks realization? These are the questions that guide the individuated life. In the end, individuation is not a solitary act. It has social implications. The more whole an individual becomes, the less they project their unresolved issues onto others. They no longer need scapegoats or idols. They can relate authentically, compassionately, and creatively. They bring their inner work into the outer world, not as dogma but as presence. They are not perfect, but they are real. And in this reality, in this commitment to inner truth, lies the secret to becoming one's best self. To understand why shadow integration is essential to growth, one must begin by acknowledging the uncomfortable truth that we are not fully aware of who we are. Much of what we consider to be ourselves is merely the part we allow to be seen, the aspects we approve of, the traits we present to others, the roles we perform to maintain the image we have constructed. Yet beneath this curated self lies a deeper, hidden dimension of the psyche, which Carl Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not simply a repository of evil or negativity. It is the container for everything within us that has been denied, rejected, or repressed. Not because it is inherently bad, but because it was deemed unacceptable by our family, culture, religion, or ego. The child who learns that anger is dangerous, or that sadness is weakness, or that ambition is arrogance, does not stop feeling those things. Instead, they bury them. These feelings go underground, slipping into the unconscious where they continue to live, influencing thoughts, behaviors, and relationships from the shadows. The shadow grows not only from what is dark, but from what is disowned. Creativity, assertiveness, vulnerability, sensuality. Any of these, if unwelcome in one's early environment, can be cast into the unconscious alongside fear and rage. Thus, the shadow becomes both a container of inner darkness and a reservoir of unrealized potential. Jung believed that ignoring the shadow is not merely a personal issue, it is a psychological danger. What we do not face in ourselves, we project onto others. When we refuse to see our own arrogance, we become hypersensitive to arrogance in others. When we deny our own aggression, We become hostile toward the hesiveness of others. In this way, the world becomes a mirror of our unconscious contents. This is why Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." The unconscious drives choices, emotions, relationships, and crises, not because we are cursed, but because we are divided within. Our lives take on the shape of the inner conflict we have refused to confront. Shadow integration, then, is the process of turning toward what has been turned away from. It is the act of bringing light to the inner darkness, not to eliminate it, but to see it clearly, to understand its origin, and to reclaim the parts of ourselves that were never truly lost, only hidden. This process is uncomfortable. The shadow does not emerge gently. It appears in dreams as monsters, in fantasies as violence, in relationships as conflict, in inner dialogue as shame or self-sabotage. It tests our self-image, challenging the ego's belief in its purity or control. But the courage to face these aspects of the self is the doorway to psychological growth. It is the difference between living a life dictated by avoidance and living a life guided by awareness. The ego often resists the shadow because it threatens the coherence of identity. If I see myself as kind, how can I admit to my envy? If I value independence, how can I acknowledge my dependence on others' approval? This resistance is natural, but must be overcome if true maturity is to be reached. Jung emphasized that we are not called to be perfect, but whole. Wholeness requires that we make space for contradiction. To integrate the shadow is to accept that one can be both kind and cruel, generous and selfish, confident and insecure. These contradictions do not negate each other. They coexist within the human condition. The person who accepts their darkness is less likely to act it out unconsciously. They become aware of their impulses and can respond with responsibility rather than repression or indulgence. There is also a strange paradox in shadow integration. The more we own our darkness, the less destructive it becomes. The things we hide tend to fester. When they are exposed to the light of consciousness, they begin to transform. Anger, once acknowledged, can become strength. Fear, when accepted, becomes caution or wisdom. Even jealousy, when seen clearly, reveals longing and unmet needs. The shadow, when rejected, controls us. When integrated, it enriches us. It adds depth and complexity to the personality. It allows us to be more authentic, more compassionate, and more grounded in reality. One of the most powerful arenas where the shadow appears is in relationships. The people we love, envy, hate, or idealize often reflect parts of ourselves we do not yet see. The partner who triggers our insecurity may be mirroring our own feelings of inadequacy. The friend we admire for their boldness may reflect our own buried confidence. When we project our shadow onto others, we lose the opportunity to see ourselves clearly. Shadow work requires that we withdraw these projections, not to condemn ourselves, but to understand. When we realize that what irritates or inspires us in others also lives within us, we begin to take responsibility for our inner life. Dreams, like projections, are another key to the shadow. In dreams, the shadow may appear as a threatening figure, a rejected friend, a beast, a stranger. Jung taught that we should not fear these images, but approach them with curiosity. The dream world is symbolic. It dramatizes the tensions and truths of the psyche. The monster in the dream is not the enemy. It is the messenger. It brings attention to something within us that demands to be seen, felt, and integrated. By dialoguing with dream images, journaling, meditating, or engaging in active imagination, we can begin to build a conscious relationship with the shadow. Shadow work is not a single event. It is an ongoing practice. The unconscious is vast, and the ego's defenses are resilient. At times we will regress. Old patterns will resurface. But each encounter with the shadow deepens our self-knowledge. It humbles the ego, reminding it that it is not the whole of who we are. It expands our humanity, allowing us to see others not as enemies or saviors, but as mirrors and fellow travelers. It fosters compassion, not only for others but for the parts of ourselves that have suffered in silence. Modern society, with its emphasis on positivity, productivity, and perfection, often leaves little room for the shadow. There is immense pressure to appear composed, successful, and emotionally regulated. But this idealization of light denies the reality of darkness, and where darkness is denied, it grows more powerful. The more we hide from our shadow, the more control it exerts over our behavior, often erupting in compulsions, addictions, outbursts, or depression. The path to healing is not in denial, but in embrace, not in suppression, but in integration. To integrate the shadow is to say yes to the full spectrum of the self. It is to acknowledge that beneath the social mask, there are wounds, desires, fears, and instincts that do not make us bad. They make us human. This acceptance is not indulgence. It is responsibility. When we take ownership of our inner world, we are no longer controlled by it. We can choose how to act rather than react. We can discern when the shadow speaks and decide whether to listen or redirect. This inner awareness is the foundation of psychological freedom. Carl Jung's insight that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate, is not a warning. It is a call to courage. The shadow is not our enemy. It is our unacknowledged self, and within it lies not only the pain we've hidden, but the power we've denied. When we turn inward and face it, we begin to live not as fragments, but as whole beings. The search for purpose has become one of the most pressing existential concerns of the modern individual. In a world saturated with information, expectations, comparisons, and social prescriptions, the question, "What should I do with my life?" is often met not with clarity, but with anxiety. Society offers many answers, some practical, some seductive, most external. Be successful, be productive, be admired, fit in, stand out. The messages are loud and contradictory, yet persistent. They form a kind of noise that drowns out the quieter, more authentic voice within the voice of the soul. For Carl Jung, this deeper voice is not a fantasy or poetic metaphor, but a real and dynamic force within the psyche. The soul, or the self, as Jung sometimes called it, carries a unique image or destiny that seeks realization in the world. To discover purpose, one must not conform to society's definitions, but attune to the inner movement of the psyche. Meaning is not imposed from the outside, it emerges from within. Jung believed that each person carries within them a kind of blueprint, not a rigid script, but a symbolic image of the person they are meant to become. This image is not consciously known at the beginning. It reveals itself gradually through dreams, intuitions, life patterns, inner conflicts, and moments of deep emotional resonance. To live without listening to this inner unfolding is to live a borrowed life. It may be socially acceptable and materially comfortable, but it lacks vitality. There is a difference between a life that is successful by society's standards and a life that is authentic to the soul's calling. The first may be full but empty. Second may be challenging but meaningful. Purpose, in the Jungian sense, is not a fixed goal or role. It is a process of becoming. The soul does not demand accomplishment, but expression. It longs to be seen, to create, to relate, to grow in ways that reflect its innermost truth. When we ignore this longing, symptoms emerge: anxiety, depression, dissatisfaction, addiction, restlessness. These are not merely problems to be solved, but signals to be interpreted. The psyche is speaking, saying, "This is not your path." Modern culture often treats these symptoms as malfunctions, as if the goal is to silence them and return to functionality. But Jung saw them as messages. They are the soul's protest against a life that has become too shallow, too artificial, too disconnected from its true nature. The voice of society is external. It is inherited through parents, schools, media, and peers. It speaks in the language of comparison and approval. It asks, what will people think? What is most practical? What is most impressive? These questions are not evil, but they are limited. They keep the individual tethered to roles and expectations that may not fit the shape of their inner life. The soul, by contrast, speaks in symbols, intuitions, synchronicities, and desires that often defy logic or tradition. It asks not what is expected of me, but what is true for me. The person who follows the voice of the soul may appear strange or rebellious in the eyes of the world, but they are living from a place of inner authority. To live according to the soul, requires a kind of inner listening that is rare in modern times. It involves turning down the volume of the external world and turning inward toward what Jung called the still, small voice. This voice is not always easy to hear. It does not shout. It often comes in moments of solitude, silence, or inner crisis. It may first appear as dissatisfaction or yearning. Something feels missing, but it cannot be named. This is the beginning of the journey. The task is not to cover up the discomfort, but to explore it. What is the psyche longing for? What is being neglected? What image or path wants to be born through me? Jung taught that each person has a task, a psychological or spiritual vocation that is unique to them. This task is not chosen in the conventional sense. It is discovered through self-reflection and inner work. The more one becomes aware of their unconscious contents, their dreams, their projections, and their true desires, the more the task begins to emerge. It may not look like a career or a title. It may be a way of being, a style of relating, a form of creative or healing work that defies categorization. Whatever it is, it brings with it a sense of rightness, a feeling of alignment with something greater than the ego. This feeling is what gives life depth and direction. Without it, life becomes mechanical or reactive. The tragedy of many lives is not that they fail by external standards, but that they succeed in roles that were never meant for them. They achieve what they thought they wanted, only to feel empty or unfulfilled. This emptiness is not a flaw. It is the soul's way of reminding the individual that they have strayed from their inner path. Jung believed that midlife crises often stem from this very misalignment. The first half of life is often spent building the ego, achieving goals, fulfilling duties. But at some point, the deeper questions emerge. Who am I beneath these roles? What truly matters to me? What have I abandoned in myself in order to fit in or succeed? These questions are not distractions. They are invitations. They signal the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming who one truly is. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung said, is to become who you truly are. This is not a given. It is an achievement, a psychological and spiritual task that requires courage, honesty, and depth. Becoming oneself means shedding false identities, confronting the shadow, integrating lost parts, and following the inner path, even when it diverges from the beaten track. It is not always comfortable or admired. It may involve solitude, conflict, or uncertainty, but it brings with it something more valuable than comfort. It brings meaning. Meaning is not something we consume or acquire. It is something we generate by living in alignment with our inner truth. The soul's path is often paradoxical. It may lead us to leave behind what seems secure in order to pursue what feels alive. It may ask us to sacrifice approval for authenticity. It may ask us to slow down when the world demands speed. The world will always offer roles, formulas, and ready-made answers. But the soul wants something else. It wants expression, depth, and connection to the eternal. It wants to make the unconscious conscious. It wants to live not as a copy but as an original. The person who listens to the soul begins to see life differently. Obstacles become lessons. Pain becomes transformation. Encounters become mirrors. The world is no longer a battlefield of competition but a landscape of meaning. The path may be narrow, but it is deeply one's own. Purpose is not a final destination but a living relationship with the self. Each step taken in authenticity, however small, is a step into wholeness. Each act of listening to the inner voice, however quiet, is an act of liberation from the tyranny of outer noise. In the modern world, people live surrounded by noise, speed, and distraction. Yet beneath the surface of activity lies a profound spiritual starvation. Despite advancements in science, technology, and communication, there is an emptiness that lingers in the psyche, a loss that cannot be resolved through logic or material success. Carl Jung recognized that this loss is not the absence of progress, but the absence of meaning. Modern people, in their efforts to master the external world, have lost contact with the symbolic dimension of life. They have forgotten how to read the language of the soul. They have turned away from the realm of myths, dreams, and imagination, those inner maps that once guided human beings toward wholeness. As a result, many drift without orientation, detached from the deeper truths that nourish the inner life. Jung understood that the psyche does not speak in facts and formulas. It speaks in images. It speaks in dreams, in archetypes, in symbols that carry layers of emotional and spiritual meaning. These symbols are not random creations of the mind. They are universal expressions of the inner world, timeless and alive. A serpent, a mountain, a tree, a journey, a hero. These are not merely cultural artifacts, but expressions of psychological realities. Myths, likewise, are not primitive superstitions, but profound narratives that reflect the structures and challenges of the psyche. They contain wisdom that cannot be fully grasped through intellect alone, but must be experienced and felt through the imagination. The loss of connection with these symbols is not merely an aesthetic or academic loss. It is a spiritual wound. To grow psychologically, one must return to the symbolic life. This does not mean escaping into fantasy or abandoning reason, but learning once again to listen to the deeper voice within. Dreams are the clearest expression of this voice. Every night the unconscious speaks through dreams, not in literal statements, but in images and events that point toward the inner condition of the soul. A falling house may symbolize the collapse of a false identity. A journey through darkness may represent the descent into unconscious material. A figure from childhood may carry unresolved emotion or wisdom long forgotten. These dream images are not meaningless. They are messages. They are the soul's way of communicating what the ego resists or avoids. But to understand them, one must cultivate a symbolic attitude. Instead of dismissing a dream as nonsense or mere biology, one must ask, what is this image showing me about myself? What part of me is speaking through this symbol? Modern people often resist this kind of reflection. The external world offers infinite ways to avoid the inner world. Entertainment, work, stimulation, consumption. These serve as distractions from the deeper encounter with the self. Jung saw this avoidance as a kind of defense, a fear of what might be found within. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. This avoidance is understandable. The inner world is not always pleasant. It contains shadow, contradiction, woundedness, and mystery. To face one's own soul is to face complexity, to confront the parts of oneself that have been denied, and to surrender the illusion of total control. But it is also the only path to real meaning. The symbolic journey into the inner world does not destroy the individual. It reveals them. Symbols have the power to reorient the psyche. They carry emotional weight and psychic energy. When a person connects with a symbol that speaks to their current psychological state, something shifts inside. A sense of coherence returns. A feeling of recognition emerges. It is as if the soul has been seen, named, and honored. This is why art, religion, myth, and ritual have always been central to human life. They are not merely cultural expressions. They are psychic necessities. They create containers for transformation, spaces in which the unconscious can be encountered and integrated. Without these symbolic structures, the psyche becomes fragmented. People lose touch with their roots, their stories, their inner compass. Jung emphasized that personal symbols are as important as collective ones. While myths may offer archetypal patterns, each individual has their own symbolic vocabulary. A dream image that appears trivial to one person may carry deep meaning for another. The task is to develop a relationship with one's own symbolic language. This requires time, reflection, and imagination. It requires slowing down and paying attention to dreams, fantasies, synchronicities, emotional reactions. It requires asking not only what is happening to me, but what is the deeper meaning of this experience? What story am I living out? What archetype is being activated in my life? Imagination is not merely a faculty for entertainment, it is a bridge to the unconscious. Jung's method of active imagination invites the individual to engage consciously with inner figures and images. Rather than repressing or rationalizing them, one enters into dialogue with them, allowing them to reveal their significance. This process can lead to insight, healing, and creative integration. It is not an escape from reality, but a deepening of it. The inner world is not separate from life. It shapes how we perceive, relate, and act in the world. By connecting with symbols and dreams, we become more attuned to the soul's direction. Many psychological symptoms are the result of a blocked or denied symbolic life. When the soul is not heard, it cries out in symptoms: depression, anxiety, disconnection, compulsions. These are not just signs of mental illness, but signals of spiritual hunger. They point to a lack of meaning, a disconnection from the inner life. Healing, then, is not simply about managing symptoms, but about recovering the symbolic connection. It is about listening to the soul is trying to say. What does the sadness want to express? What does the fear protect? What image or myth might give shape to the inner struggle? In traditional cultures, myths served as maps for the journey of life. They offered orientation in times of crisis, transition, and transformation. The hero's journey, the descent into the underworld, the death and rebirth motif. These are not just stories, but reflections of psychological processes. When a person undergoes a crisis, they are not simply malfunctioning. They may be entering a symbolic death, a shedding of an old identity. When they feel lost or alone, they may be in the wilderness stage of the myth, awaiting guidance from within. When they experience a breakthrough, they are crossing the threshold into a new level of consciousness. These myths help individuals make sense of their experiences. They provide a narrative container for psychological growth. Without myth and symbol, modern people often feel isolated in their suffering. They think their pain is meaningless, their confusion a personal failure. But when seen symbolically, suffering becomes part of a larger story. The loss, the fear, the struggle, all become meaningful steps in a process of transformation. This symbolic perspective does not eliminate pain, but it gives it purpose. It reconnects the individual to the deeper layers of the psyche, to the timeless movements of the soul. To return to symbols, myths, and dreams is not to regress into superstition, but to remember what the soul has always known. It is to reawaken the imagination, to honor the wisdom of the unconscious, and to restore depth to a life that has become too shallow. It is to listen not just with the mind, but with the heart, to the ancient language of the inner world. In doing so, the individual reclaims their spiritual inheritance. They rediscover a source of guidance that is uniquely their own, yet connected to something universal. They learn to navigate life not just through plans and strategies, but through intuition, resonance, and meaning. And in that return to the symbolic life, the soul is no longer avoided. It is encountered, honored, and lived. In the end, the journey to becoming your best self is not a matter of chasing perfection, external validation, or superficial improvement. It is a deep, inward path of becoming whole, of integrating the hidden aspects of your psyche, facing your shadow, honoring your dreams, and listening to the voice of your soul rather than the noise of society. True self-improvement is not about adding more, but about remembering and reclaiming what has been lost within. It is about walking the symbolic path, trusting the images that arise from within, and courageously becoming who you were always meant to be. The greatest privilege of life, as Jung said, is not to become what the world expects, but to become who you truly are. Thank you for taking the time to explore this journey with such depth and seriousness. May you walk your path with courage, curiosity, and compassion. Trust your inner voice, honor your dreams, and never forget that wholeness, not perfection, is the real destination. Good luck, and may your soul always guide you home.